We are so grateful to see you with us today. My name is Destiny Magna. I'm the Programs and Outreach Manager here at Churches for Middle East Peace. And I am so grateful today to be joined by our Executive Director, the Reverend Dr. Mae Elise Cannon, who is going to be sharing just some snapshots from her extensive travels over about the last month. I see a lot of familiar names in the audience. It's wonderful to see so many of you, but for those of you who might be new to Churches for Middle East Peace, I'll just share briefly that Churches for Middle East Peace, or CMEP, is a coalition of more than 30 national denominations and communions who have come together to promote U.S. policies that promote a just and lasting resolution to the conflicts in the Middle East, with a special focus on Israel and Palestine. As I mentioned, Reverend Dr. Mae Elise Cannon has been traveling extensively over the past month. We began in Seattle together on a speaking tour. She went off to Korea, to the Middle East and Europe. And today we're going to focus on the Middle East portion of her travel in Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Mae, if you'd like to share your screen and dive in. If you have questions along the way, I encourage you to use the Q&A feature. That's the easiest place for us to see those, but we'll have some time at the end for audience Q&A about Mae's experiences and reflections.
Thanks, Destiny. I was grateful to have time with her in Seattle, and it was wonderful to be with some of our churches and Christian leaders. And one of the things, Destiny, I can't remember if it was updating the board today or different, I can't remember what meeting it was in this morning when Destiny shared about our time in Seattle. But one of the things that we noticed was all of the gatherings that we had, the attendance was higher than we anticipated. And some of the churches that we met with invited us to come back again in the spring already. And so the eagerness of communities to hear about what's happening in the Middle East is one of the things that's been encouraging. And, you know, one of the scriptural passages that I've been carrying with me this past year is from Romans chapter 12. And Romans 12:9 has been a bit of my mantra. It says, love must be sincere, hate what is evil, and cling to what is good. And initially, you know, October a year ago, I felt guilty when I was experiencing joy, or when I would be with even people, you know, other pastors or leaders, or when I would go to protests or prayer gatherings or vigils, and I would see people and I would feel good, and I would feel guilty about feeling good. And one of the things I feel like God has been showing me is just that it's right when we feel joy being together, and when we're able to encourage one another. And so as I've traveled this last month, that was one of those overwhelming feelings I had, that it was good to be together with people in Seattle. And then I was with, you know, people in Palestine and people throughout the Middle East. And it was such a gift to be able to be together. And so there's these horrors and atrocities that, you know, I still feel like I cry every day. And yet there's also this joy and beauty of being able to be alongside of people who are working together for good and for peace. And so in that regard, I want to tell you about the specific Middle Eastern portion of my trip. I was asked to lead a delegation by the South African Council of Churches. And so you'll see here members of that delegation. We were hosted in Egypt by a group called CEOSS. CEOSS is an acronym. If you know me well, you know that I am terrible at many things, but two of them are acronyms and remembering people's names. So CEOSS stands for something, Coptic Evangelical something Society. It is the largest, Destiny's probably typing it in the chat right now. I can't see the chat. If I know Destiny, I believe that she has done that already. The gentleman in the purple shirt here is Reverend Dr. Andrea Zaki. He is the Executive Director of CEOSS. I've known him for a long time. But CEOSS is the largest Christian development organization in the Middle East, and they hosted us in Egypt. I was hosting the South African Council of Churches. The person to Andrea's left is Bishop Malusi. Bishop Malusi is the chair of the South African Council of Churches. And we were going to the Middle East, essentially asking the question of, political actors have failed us. So what can global religious leaders do in this moment when a ceasefire and an end to war and violence is so desperately needed? And so we specifically went to Egypt to meet with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar is the academic institution world-renowned for teaching Islamic scholars in Sunni Islam. And so that was the main purpose of why we were going to Egypt. Because CMEP has relationships in Egypt, the South African Council of Churches asked if we would host. Bishop Mae Elise is the chair, general secretary of the South African Council of Churches. I've gotten to know him over the last several years. I kept saying he was the instigator for this trip. He kept saying CMEP was the instigator for this trip. So he pointed back to a trip that CMEP led in 2019, which I don't know if you know this story, Destiny, maybe you do, but there was a trip in 2019 that was South African church leaders and African American church leaders that went to the Holy Land. And some very renowned Black leaders from the US went on that trip, including one of the now senators from Georgia, who is a preacher. And so on that trip, the South African Council of Churches had the idea that religious leaders need to be a moral voice calling for an end to war. And so the question that we were asking was, at this moment, what can we do? And so here you see Bishop Mae Elise, you see Andrea Zaki, the woman to my right is Balelwa, who is the chief of operations for the South African Council of Churches. The man to her right is the head of the Catholic. He's the president. That's Bishop Sepuka. He is the president of the South African Council of Churches. The gentleman to his right is Reverend Dr. Khader Al-Yatim, who is the head of global engagement for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. So that was our delegation, the however many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of us. And the rest are all staff members from CEOSS. Also in Egypt, the main purpose was to have these meetings with these key Islamic leaders. And so I'll go through and talk about who we met with specifically. I feel like there's a lot happening on my screen, but the main purpose was this gentleman here, who is the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. One of the things that was very interesting is, in general, observant Muslims, of course, when you're in the Middle East as a woman, you wouldn't shake hands. You wouldn't, you typically greet by putting your hand on your chest. And you'll see in this bottom picture here, this is the Minister of Endowment, which is the second highest Islamic leader, some would say in the whole Arab world, but certainly in Egypt. It was quite a privilege to meet both of these Islamic leaders. Both the Grand Imam and the Islamic leader of Endowment shook my hand, which is really a sign of them stepping out of their own faith tradition to build bridges. And the conversations that we had were about what's happening in Gaza. Both of the conversations were incredibly congenial, which is quite significant considering the role that the US is playing in continuing to arm and to further militarize the war, not only that's happening in Gaza, but now increasingly that's happening in Lebanon. And so, we talked about the work that we're doing at Churches for Middle East Peace. The bishops from South Africa talked about the work the South African Council of Churches is doing. And both the Minister of Endowment and the Grand Imam talked about what's happening within the Islamic community. One of the things that people may not know is that the Grand Imam issued a fatwa over the last year. It is considered haram. It's considered it's against Islamic law to kill women and children. And so the October 7th attacks are against Islamic law in terms of murder, just the way that we would say thou shalt not kill in Christian law, that it is against Islamic law. And so we talked about that. We talked about the language that he used was Israeli aggression against Gaza, the number of civilians that have been killed in Gaza. But he also talked about the way the way that killing and murder is against Islamic law as well. And so we had conversations about what might we do together. And I'm not at liberty right now to talk about some of the plans and things that we are exploring. I can say that we are in conversation with other, international Christian groups and international interreligious groups about what possibilities there might be. But part of the conversation that we're having is that global political leaders have failed, that here now, more than a year into, what's been happening in Gaza with massive civilian deaths, with a death toll at more than 42,000 people, with hostages continue to be held, with thousands of people being held unjustly in Israeli prisons, the death toll now in Lebanon alone is more than 2,000 people. The death toll in the West Bank is more than 700 people. That these conversations across religious divides are all the more critical. I will say after these meetings, there was a lot of news in the Arabic media. What was presented in the Arabic media about what we discussed was translated a bit differently than the rhetoric that was used in the actual meetings. And so I was a little bit nervous traveling into Israel after this was all over, the media. I did, it's not funny, but, imagine that the media didn't get it right, it was kind of what I was thinking about a little bit. But I think we were very pleased with how we were received. There's another body that's called the Muslim, what's the name of it, Destiny? The Muslim Council of 12. That is a group of 12 Muslim global leaders, of which Al-Azhar University is a part of it. We have been introduced to those leaders as well, and we'll be having subsequent subsequent meetings with that council moving forward as well. Also, in Egypt, we met with other Christian leaders. We met with evangelical leaders. This is the Cairo Evangelical Theological Seminary, of which Reverend El-Yatim attended. He was actually classmates with the gentleman you see in the light blue shirt in that photograph. He is the pastor of Qasr al-Dabara. Qasr al-Dabara is one of the largest churches. It's an evangelical church in Egypt. We met, his name is Pastor Samek Maurice. So we met with Samek Maurice at his church, Qasr al-Dabara. Both of them, Khader and Samek, attended the Evangelical Theological Seminary in Cairo. And so it was really fun because Khader, traveling with him all over Egypt, he had attended seminary with a lot of people we kept running into. And so it's kind of like a grand reunion. The woman here in this photograph at the seminary, that's Anne Zaki. Anne, if the Presbyterian Church in Egypt ordained women, she would be one of the first ordained women in the Presbyterian Church. They do not currently. There are no women that are ordained in the church in Egypt as of yet, but she is a professor at the seminary. She and I had just been together in Lausanne. She was one of the keynote speakers at Lausanne. The Lausanne Congress was why I was in Seoul. In South Korea. It was a gathering of 5,000 evangelical leaders. And it was quite significant for her to be doing an exegesis of the scriptures, as a woman in that context amongst those evangelical leaders. This is His Holiness Pope Theodros. He is the head of the Coptic Orthodox Church. We had the opportunity to be received by him and to be blessed by him. The Coptic church dynamics are quite complex because of the politics in Egypt. When I met with the Egyptian ambassador to the United States in October of last year, one of the things he said to me, because we often are meeting with the Egyptians and are talking about human rights concerns in Egypt. And so after the October 7th attacks last year, we met with him and we're talking about our concerns about what was happening in Gaza. And so one of the things he said to me after that meeting was, it's nice to be on the same side with you for once. It's nice to agree with you about something. And so one of the challenges, I think, for the Coptic Orthodox Church is, the population in Egypt now is roughly 90 million people, or maybe they're saying it's 112 million people, but roughly 10% of the population of Egypt is Christian, and of that 10%, only 1% are Protestant. The rest are Coptic Orthodox. And in large part, the Coptic Orthodox Church seeks to disengage from politics because of some of the dynamics that we often challenge the Egyptian government about. That's why I was bringing up the meetings with the ambassador. So this is His Holiness Pope Tawadros, who we had the opportunity to be with as well. We did other meetings in Egypt. We did meet with ambassadors from the government to talk about human rights concerns. I will say Egypt right now, the Rafah border currently is being controlled, the Rafah border between Gaza and Egypt is being controlled by the Israelis. Right now, the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel is in violation. One of the things that is surprising a lot of people is, why is Egypt not raising more of a fuss? Why is Egypt not more upset about the violations of the peace agreement? And I'm not going to make any deductions. I will let you make deductions and just say that one of the things that has happened in the past several weeks is that the U.S. just fulfilled a military agreement in terms of sending arms to Egypt. And it's the first time the arms that have been sent to Egypt has been completely fulfilled in years. And so, Egypt receives a huge amount of foreign assistance from the United States, and also military assistance from the United States as well. And so I will let you make deductions in terms of why Egypt maybe is being quiet in terms of some of the dynamics related to Gaza and the crisis with Israel right now. From Egypt, only Bishop Malusi and I went to Jordan. We were only in Jordan about 48 hours. We went to Jordan the day after the Iran attack. Our flights were canceled. And so we only had a day of meetings in Jordan. It was a bit concerning how we were going to get to Amman for our meetings. We had meetings with the Royal Palace. We had meetings with, senior members of the government. So the gentleman there on the left who we're speaking with, that is the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. His name is Ayman Safadi. We've met with him several times before as Churches for Middle East Peace. If you're not familiar with his role and if you're not familiar with his articulation, I'd encourage you to look him up. Ayman Safadi is his name. We talked most extensively about the situation and the crisis in Lebanon. One of the things he talked about a lot is that as the crisis with Lebanon continues, there will be more and more pressure on the government of Lebanon to intervene. And what he meant is, right now, the way that things are being articulated is that the war on the border between Israel and Lebanon, it's been called, a Hezbollah and Israel, right? That the battles are between militias, the Hezbollah militias, and the Israeli military. But as more and more civilians are being affected, more than 1 million people have already been displaced in Lebanon. The death toll is more than 2,000 people. More than 1,400 people in the last 2 weeks alone have been killed in Lebanon. As that continues, the Lebanese military will be increasingly pressured to engage and to respond. He was making the assertion that if or when the Lebanese military responds and engages, that they will be decimated by the Israeli military. The Israeli military is so much more powerful and stronger than the Lebanese military. And he was saying, who will be the most affected by that? He was saying that those that are the most vulnerable within the society, particularly the Christians. And his point was also that one of the things that you see in the Middle East is that Christians are often the only part of the population that can get visas to be able to leave, that Christians have access to the West, Christians have a tendency to be the wealthier members of the society. And so Christians, Lebanon has been considered to be, the Christian community in Lebanon is considered to be one of the strongest Christian communities throughout the whole Middle East. And so one of the great concerns is that, Lebanon has been going through an economic crisis long before last October. The Christian community there, in large part, has been very stable. You have a Protestant community, you have a very diverse community with Maronite Catholics. You have Armenian Christians, you have the Armenian University there with Hagazian University. But as the war between Hezbollah and Israel, if that extends certainly to include the Lebanese army, if it continues, Christians will leave because they can, but also that they will be pressured and forced out. And so he was talking about not only the eradication, as we've been worried about, of Christian community in Gaza. More than 3% of the Christians that have existed in Gaza have already been killed. Not only worries about the Christian community in Palestine, in East Jerusalem, but looking at the possibility of Christians disappearing in Lebanon as well. And so that was a significant part of our discussion. The gentleman here you see in the light brown suit is His Royal Highness Prince Hassan of the Royal Court of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Prince Hassan is a scholar. I did not do this, and I almost wish I had. We were with him for about an hour, and he put slides up on the board and gave us his analysis, an academic analysis of what he sees happening in Gaza and the broader Middle East. And one of the things he talked about was what's happening in Gaza and the forced displacement of the population of North Gaza and the implications of that, but specifically the implications of that in light of plans that have been in existence long before this current conflict and escalation. So he was talking about, for example, the Ben Gurion Canal. I'd not heard of the Ben Gurion Canal before Prince Hassan talked about it a few weeks ago. I read about this daily. I study about this daily. I shared this in one of my daily updates, and somebody said, "You haven't heard of the the Ben Gurion Canal Plan?" And I had not. And then I looked it up, and it has been written about quite extensively. But the Ben Gurion Canal Plan is a plan to build a canal that would be parallel to the Suez Canal. It's a plan that would cost $100 billion. Once it is built and fully operational, the idea is that annually it would bring in about $10 billion a year. And part of what Prince Hassan's analysis was is that the displacement of all people and the decimation of northern Gaza is a part of what's required to give access to that portion of the Mediterranean. The plan for where the Ben Gurion Canal would actually be constructed between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean would need to go through North Gaza. And so there are maps and things that are available online that he pulled out. There also are plans for gas pipelines and economic plans, and that were in existence long before October, that were a part of what he would say is a larger part of a strategy that is at play that should not be ignored: an economic strategy, a development strategy. And I just want to make note here, one of the conversations that we had in Jerusalem was a conversation with Danny Seidemann, who is a Jerusalem expert, who said something very similar, totally different context. The context is Jerusalem, not Gaza. But one of the things Danny said is, he said, often we look at situations in a microcosm and we don't see the bigger picture. We look at Sheikh Jarrah and we see the displacement of families in Sheikh Jarrah, and we don't see how that's connected to what's happening on the Temple Mount, or we don't see how that's connected to what's happening on the Mount of Olives. And so with Danny was talking about how there is a plan that has been in existence, the plan, and one of the things that happens is a lot of these are public, but we just don't see how they're connected. And so Danny was talking about how there is a plan for a national park project And the National Park Project would actually be built in locations where there are church properties, and it would use eminent domain. And part of this plan is connecting the national park. There would be a pathway that would be built down the Mount of Olives. And the plan in Jerusalem would include this pathway that actually goes through some of the holiest sites in Christianity, where we call it like Jesus's triumphal entry, that pathway where we, as Christians, when we celebrate Palm Sunday, or I've been there for Palm Sunday, or many of you have walked this pathway, right? Like we've walked down the Mount of Olives, but where there would be an alternative, a national park that is that would literally destroy and use eminent domain to take over some of the properties. Now, this might sound crazy, but then when you go to places, which I'll talk in a minute, I can't remember if I put Sent of Nations pictures here. I can't even remember if I finished these slides. I don't know what I've done today. So. But Danny's point was how these things are connected. The National Park Project, this pathway, and that pathway connects the national park down the Mount of Olives. And it goes right through Sheikh Jarrah. And so the displacement of these families with Sheikh Jarrah, which are Muslim families, is directly connected to the struggle that Christians may be having related to these Christian properties on the Mount of Olives. And so those were things that we were talking to Princess Hassan about related to master plans in terms of the future of Gaza. What's this mean for the north of Gaza? What are the plans related to why are the people of North Gaza being displaced? So we then went and crossed the Allenby Bridge. I did not have any trouble getting into the West Bank or traveling into Jerusalem or traveling into Israel. We did meet with Jewish leaders. We did meet with Palestinian Christian leaders. I won't go through all of the people we met with. And I'll stop in maybe 5 minutes or so. We had some meetings with political analysts about negotiations, about where do we go from here. We did talk about, I just mentioned the current status of Jerusalem, the threat not only to the sustainability of the Christian community, but also one of the things we've been talking about is that the threats that are existing towards the Christian community are not only to the Christian community, they are to anyone that are non-conformist Jews. Any group that is not radicalized or that is not right-wing are experiencing some of the same threats that the Christian community is experiencing, particularly in the old city of Jerusalem. I know that many of you are familiar, and Destiny has been leading this, and I'm really grateful. We're in the middle of this mini course right now that is highlighting some of the core issues. And I think at the end, Destiny, I hope you'll invite people to participate in some of the activities that we have highlighting these specific issues. But, I mentioned Sheikh Jarrah and the Mount of Olives, but Al Mahor is the area by Beit Jala. And we have this mini course that's called Holding On in the Dark, highlighting the ways that Palestinian Christian communities are specifically affected. I had the opportunity to spend time with some dear, dear friends and people who I love very much, who are part of our community and network. I hope and I think that some of you on the call are joining us in a few weeks. I know Ben, who is a part of our staff team, will be traveling with us in a few weeks. And we were just talking about, what do we do if Israel attacks Iran? And what if there's a counterattack? And we've been talking through all those scenarios, and the Lord willing, that won't happen. But if it does, we have plans in place. We are still planning on having a trip go that Destiny will co-lead. And if you are interested in traveling with us, there is still an opportunity. And we will be rendezvousing in Jericho for the NCW Rise Summit. This is the leadership team, the Palestinian women who are putting that together. And so I had the opportunity to be with them. And, they just said to me that it is some of the hardest times they've ever experienced, and yet they still want to live. And so they dress up on Sunday morning and they go to church, and they said, we want to be together and we want to have something to look forward to. And so it was good to be together in that regard, and good to plan and dream and pray and laugh and fellowship. And then I had the opportunity to spend a significant amount of time at the Tent of Nations. This is Dawood Nasser and his sister Amal, which means hope. And the Tent of Nations, I think most of you know that story, but 100 acres that has been in their family for generations. They have documentation from every period since the time of the Ottomans. They are still trying to register the land with the Israeli government. I was just with them a few months ago looking at maps and seeing about the encroachment of settlements, and I still had no idea how different it is. I just was there in January, and so in the last 9 months, someone on our board call said just even in the last few months, because they were there a few months ago, there are caravans that are literally up right against their property. Dawood said that they don't have access to 50% of their land because they're afraid that they will be shot at if they go on the hillside. There are parts of the land where a road was built on by settlers. They did get an injunction by one of the courts. They have multiple court cases going on at the same time. And so we just walked through the property. We walked through all the scenarios. We're continuing to advocate with them, with the Palestinian OPA, the Office of Palestinian Affairs, with the U.S. government. And so we'll be doing continued advocacy alongside of the Tent of Nations as well as they prepare for their next court case and hearing. And it was good to be with them, and so discouraging to be with them as well. And so the verse I just wanted to end with is the Hebrews 10:23. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And I believe that to be true, that the times are so desperate, and yet I believe that God is present, and that God has called us to seek to be present and seek to be faithful in our advocacy in the midst of this. And I think I'll stop there, Destiny.
Amen. Thank you, Mae. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If you have questions and want to put those in the chat or the Q&A feature. Or even if you raise your hand, I think I can, we're a small enough group, I can give folks just permission to say their questions aloud if you like to. Come on, nobody has a question? Normally we have the opposite problem in these moments.
So Martha just asked if we're going through Amman to get to Jericho. That's what we're recommending, Martha. Flights are still going in and out of Tel Aviv. The flights that are the most consistent are either the Arab carriers or specifically El Al. El Al, even when the Iran attacks happened, I think the airport was, I don't even know if the airport was closed for a full day. I think it was only closed for a part of a day, and El Al flights continued to go. I know many of us have had difficulty, or it can be traumatic to fly El Al with the questions that they ask, the levels of security that they pose. So I travel in and out of Amman, and that's what we're recommending for those traveling with us as well.
See a couple of questions here. So then we have a question. How did it feel traveling there? Did you feel safe? And I know you got a flat tire at one point, so maybe you can share what that was like.
Yeah. So thanks, Dana. You know, I have lived in Jerusalem, and so I know that others may not feel as comfortable as I do. I drive and rent a car, and feel very comfortable in general. The last time I was there was in May, and I went through Amman, and I could almost, in May, I could almost feel going from Amman into the West Bank, like tension. Um, I would say in terms of January, in January, all of the villages were closed off. In May, they were not closed off. So there was more mobility in May than there was in January. This time I was there during the high, there for Yom Kippur. I was there for October 7th. I was there right after the Iran attack. I'm not trying to overstate this. I was overwhelmed by how safe I felt. I was like, what? Like it was unnerving. It was like, well, because I expected it to be, and now maybe it's because I expected like I was going into a war zone and Iran had just attacked and there were, missiles had been falling, a few hours before I'd gotten there. I think people in Jordan were more upset by the missiles because the missiles flew over Jordan. And so that was very unusual for the people in Jordan. And so that was a big conversation when I was there. The people in Palestine, some of the conversations were that the missiles that had been dropped from Iran were empty, that they didn't have cartridges in them, that they didn't explode. And so some of the Palestinians, where cartridges had fallen, were joking about how they'd go out and have a barbecue out by them, like by the cartridges. Now, that's not going to make anybody in the US feel safe, but that is kind of now some of that can be a little bit of also, I know, Destiny, we've talked about this, like the normalization of you're in this type of place where that, that type of attitude type of thing is, you become accustomed to it. But I felt incredibly safe. And it was actually calmer and easier to get around than it was in May and in January.
And I saw Sherry's question in the chat, but yes, the trip we're talking about is our And So We Rise Women's Empowerment Summit, which is going to be in Jericho, November 15th to 17th. And then a smaller group, about 10 of us, will be traveling ahead of time for some other solidarity visits and things. And it's not too late to join us. So if you're interested, we would feel very blessed to have you with us in Jericho. I think it's going to be a really special time together.
I think it will be. Mm-hmm. So the story that Destiny was talking about, here I have Bishop Malusi, the esteemed bishop, who knew Nelson Mandela and was friends with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and we're driving around the West Bank. And, the way you have to get to the Tent of Nations is now circuitously through these Palestinian villages. And we're on our way home, and not only do I get lost, but I get a flat tire. And so I'm lost in like the hills of Bethlehem, which gives you all confidence that you should drive with me throughout Palestine. And so I have a flat tire, and like Palestinians are kind of pointing and they're like, look, you have a flat tire. And I don't really speak Arabic very well at all. And so we find what do you call the places where you get your car fixed?
In mechanic or an auto repair shop.
Right. An auto repair shop. And I'm like, I know enough Arabic to say, like, I have a problem. Will you come look at this? And these young Palestinian men, like, come look. And they're like, okay, come on in. So the flat is so bad, it can't be repaired. So they have to jack the car up and put a different tire on. And I mean, this is a big deal, right? And so they fix up the car. And then we go to pay and they won't let us pay. And the whole time, like, they don't speak English. And, I was able to say I'm from America, and I did apologize. And I said, Ana Dahab Philistine, which is like, I love Palestine. I just wanted to let them know, like, we're okay. Don't worry. And it was so sweet. They were so kind. They wouldn't let us pay a penny. They just were like as hospitable could be. And it was such a beautiful experience. And it come to find out, I was in a refugee camp. Like I was in like Daesha, is that how you pronounce it? Like I was in Daesha refugee camp, which has the reputation for being like one of the like, most militant, there you have it. So, I just thought here you have to go home and tell the story about these militant Palestinians who took such good care of, the bishop and the lost pastor.
I visited Daisha when I was living in Bethlehem, and I remember there was a woman selling fruit on the side of the road, and when this group of foreigners walked up, she insisted that we all had to try her fruit, and also it was to be a gift. We were not to pay her for the fruit that she gave to us. And so I also had a really beautiful experience in Daisha Camp, which is sort of like south of Bethlehem, kind of area, for those of you who are familiar. Yeah, beautiful. And so classic. I completely agree, Mercy. The generosity and hospitality is amazing.
It's
We
so
can all
beautiful.
take a lesson from that kind of attitude. Well, we're in our last few minutes, so I think I will close by sharing a couple of upcoming opportunities we have to stay engaged with Churches for Middle East Peace in our work. Mae mentioned earlier, we're doing a fall mini-series called Holding On in the Dark, Palestinians Pursuing Justice Under Occupation. I'll put the link to the full series in the chat where you can find the individual sessions. We had our first session this week, which was an overview of the occupation and the Israeli legal system with Jessica Montel from Hamoked. It was excellent. It is on our YouTube page now, so you can catch up there. Next week, we'll be highlighting Al-Makrour. The following week, we'll highlight Leon Nasser. The fourth session will be on Shadi Khouri. These cases may be familiar to you. If not, read a bit about them and then come and join us for our sessions. And we're eager to share these cases and really spotlight these individual examples of land annexation, of detention, the struggle for justice, as a way to not only shed light for these individuals, but on the larger systems at play, and recognizing that these cases in many ways are not unique and are suffered by dozens of people and families under occupation. And so I think it's going to be a great series. We would love for you to join us in the future sessions. Then the last thing that I want to share on a spiritual note is this year, Churches for Middle East Peace's Advent devotional is called An Advent Journey of Courage, as we're thinking about what it means for us as individuals, what it means for us as the church to bear witness and live in solidarity right now. We're highlighting a number of Middle East voices and authors, and then reflections from our community here in the US. So that will be available very soon, and you can sign up to be notified when it's available here. And I think that is going to be a really beautiful way to continue to center Palestine as we very soon enter the Advent season. I can't believe it's just around the corner. Mae, do you have any closing words in our final minute together?
Just that I'm grateful. I mean, I see the names of who all is here. I'm grateful for your prayers, for your support, for each of your efforts. They're so incredibly necessary as we see the news and the updates that are coming out of the region. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all. And we hope to see you again soon. Thanks for all of your community and support. Blessings to you in the week ahead.